History isn't shaped by heroes, it's carved by betrayal. Every empire that ever rose did so on the promise of trust, and every empire that fell did so because someone broke it. In part 1, we saw Caesar's murder, Judas's deal, and Quisling's fall from grace. But those were only the beginning, because the deeper you look into history, the clearer it becomes that betrayal doesn't fade, it evolves. And the next 10 stories will prove that some of the world's greatest downfalls began not with an army, but with a handshake. Alcibiades and Athens, 5th century BCE. Brilliance and ego often share the same body, and Alcibiades was proof of that. He was young, magnetic, and dazzlingly intelligent. A student of Socrates who could win over a crowd as easily as he could outthink a rival. To Athens, he was the golden boy of democracy, destined to secure victory in the Peloponnesian War. But ambition has a habit of devouring its masters. Just as the city prepared to launch its massive expedition against Sicily, Alcibiades was accused of sacrilege, defacing sacred statues in an act the people call blasphemy. He swore his innocence, but Athens ordered him home for trial. Instead of returning, Alcibiades fled, straight into the arms of Athens' greatest enemy, Sparta. There he revealed every secret he knew. The fleet's route, its weaknesses, even the strategies Athens would rely on. His betrayal helped Sparta shatter the Athenian offensive and turn the tide of the war. Later, when Sparta grew weary of his shifting loyalties, he defected again, this time to Persia. By the end of his life, no one trusted him. Athens had fallen, Sparta was spent, and Persia had no use for him. The man who once belonged everywhere ended up belonging nowhere. But betrayal doesn't always die with the traitor. The next one turned a nation's faith into rebellion and cost a king his crown. Bolesław the Bold versus Bishop Stanislaus in 1079. In medieval Poland, King Bolesław II, known as the Bold, was a ruler of ambition and pride. He strengthened the army, defined foreign influence, and dreamed of turning his kingdom into a regional power. But his pride grew heavier than his crown, and soon even the church began to fear him. Among his critics was Bishop Stanislaus of Krakow, a man of faith but also of influence. He condemned the king's brutality, accusing him of corruption and cruelty. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, such words were a declaration of war. Boleslav saw it as treason wrapped in holiness. He ordered the bishop seized, and according to some chronicles, violence broke out even within the church itself. A sacred place turned into a scene of outrage. The outrage was immediate. Nobles and clergy rose in revolt, branding Boleslav not as the bold, but as the accursed. Within months, the once mighty king was dethroned and forced into exile, dying alone in Hungary. So you see, some betrayals destroy trust, while others destroy mercy itself. And the next unfolded in Byzantium, where a man's hunger for power left even his own emperor in darkness. Michael VIII Palaiologos, 1261. Byzantium had already fallen once, before Michael Palaiologos ever saw the throne. The Latin Crusaders had taken Constantinople, leaving the empire in pieces. But Michael was clever, patient, and ruthless enough to rebuild it. In 1261, through a mix of diplomacy and deceit, he recaptured the great city and restored the Byzantine Empire. The people hailed him as a savior. Yet one man stood between him and absolute power. The rightful young emperor, John IV Lascaris. Michael had promised to protect him as regent. Instead, he sent soldiers into the boys' chamber and ordered them to blind him, ensuring the child could never rule. It was a betrayal so brutal that even in a world of coups and conspiracies, it shocked the empire. The church condemned him, his family name was cursed, and whispers of divine punishment followed him until his death. But Michael died on his throne, proving that in Byzantium, treachery wasn't always punished. Sometimes it was rewarded. Empires built on betrayal rarely need enemies. Their danger lies within, and one noble from England would soon prove it by turning the Wars of the Roses upside down. Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, 15th century. Few men in English history wielded power like Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, better known as the Kingmaker. He wasn't born to rule, yet kings bent to his will. During the Wars of the Roses, when the houses of York and Lancaster tore England apart, Neville stood as the master of balance, deciding who would wear the crown. At first, he backed the Yorkist cause, helping Edward IV rise to power. It was Neville's influence, armies, and money that made Edward king, but power shared as power resented. Edward married in secret, favored new advisors, and ignored Neville's counsel. The Kingmaker felt sidelined, betrayed by the very monarch he had created. So he struck back. He turned against Edward, restored the deposed Henry VI, and plunged England into fresh chaos. Yet the throne he rebuilt soon collapsed again. Edward returned, crushed Neville's forces at Barnet, and left the Kingmaker dead on the field he once controlled. Richard Neville's downfall showed how fragile loyalty becomes when ambition starts pulling the strings, and not long after his death, betrayal would creep behind the walls of the most fortified city in the world and open its gates to an empire. The fall of Constantinople, 1453. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as the jewel of Christendom, a fortress city wrapped in walls no army could break. But when the Ottomans came in 1453, the greatest threat to the city wasn't only outside its gates, it was already inside. As Sultan Mehmed II's army surrounded the walls, internal division tore the defenders apart. Byzantine leaders argued over strategy, faith, and pride. Venetian and Genoese allies refused to cooperate, each serving their own interests. Some merchants secretly sold supplies to the besiegers for gold. Others whispered that surrender might preserve their status once the city fell. When the Ottomans finally breached the walls, it wasn't pure might that won the day. It was exhaustion, confusion, and betrayal. Some defenders fled their posts. Some opened gates meant to stay sealed. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets, abandoned by men who had sworn loyalty to him. The city's fall marked the end of an empire and the birth of a new one, but treachery didn't end at the gates of Constantinople. In England, another betrayal soon unfolded in royal blood, one that erased 2 children from history. The Princes in the Tower, 1483. Few betrayals in English history are as haunting as the mystery of the Princes in the Tower. When King Edward IV died, his 12-year-old son Edward V was next in line. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector and guardian, meant to defend the boy until his coronation. But power has a way of twisting guardians into kings. Richard escorted his nephew and the boy's younger brother to the Tower of London, supposedly for their safety. Then came the proclamations. Edward IV's marriage was declared invalid. His son suddenly deemed illegitimate. Days later, Richard was crowned King Richard III. The princes were never seen again. Rumors spread across England, and the boys were smothered in their sleep. Their bodies buried beneath the stones. No trial, no confession, only silence. And in that silence, Richard's reign began to rot. Within 2 years, he fell at Bosworth, his crown seized by Henry Tudor, the dynasty that would redefine England. The prince's disappearance remains unsolved, but its message never faded. The closer one stands to the throne, the sharper betrayal becomes. Far across the ocean, another ruler will soon learn that lesson when a handshake with a conquistador became his death sentence. Francisco Pizarro and Atahualpa, 1533. In the highlands of Peru, 2 worlds met under a banner of false friendship. Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador driven by gold and glory, came face to face with Atahualpa, the newly crowned emperor of the Inca Empire. Their first meeting seemed peaceful, an exchange of gifts, words, and promises of alliance. But beneath Pizarro's smiles was calculation, not diplomacy. When Atahualpa arrived at Cajamarca with thousands of unarmed soldiers, Pizarro sprung the trap. Hidden cannons and soldiers erupted in chaos, devastating the Inca ranks. Atahualpa was seized alive, humiliated before his people, and held for ransom. The emperor offered a room filled with gold and silver in exchange for his release, a fortune so vast it took months to collect. Pizarro accepted the treasure, then broke his word. Atahualpa was condemned in a mock trial and met his death soon after. With his death, the Inca Empire fractured, opening the Andes to Spanish conquest. It was betrayal dressed as negotiation, and it reshaped a continent. But Pizarro's treachery wouldn't remain unmatched for long. Across the ocean, another man's betrayal would hand over an entire nation before the first shot was fired. Mir Jafar and the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In the sweltering fields of Bengal, a single betrayal opened the door to 2 centuries of British rule in India. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, commanded one of the richest provinces in the world. The East India Company wanted control of it. But they didn't need to win a war. They only needed one man inside. That man was Mir Jafar, Siraj's own commander. The company promised him the throne in exchange for his cooperation. On the day of the Battle of Plassey, the Nawab's army outnumbered the British nearly 10-1. Victory seemed inevitable. Yet when the cannons thundered, Mir Zafar's troops stood still. He watched as his ruler's army crumbled, refusing to join the fight. By sunset, Siraj ad-Dawla was defeated, captured, and killed. Mir Zafar was crowned the new Nawab, but the throne he gained was a hollow one. The British soon stripped him of power, reducing him to a puppet in his own court. His name became synonymous with treason across South Asia, a warning that still echoes through history. Greed can be dressed in loyalty, but once the mask slips, even allies become executioners. The next betrayal would prove it, when a soldier who once swore his life to his emperor turned his sword against him. Marshal Ney and Napoleon in 1815. Michel Ney was more than one of Napoleon's generals. He was his blade, brave to the point of recklessness. Ney even fought in nearly every major campaign of the French Empire. Napoleon himself called him the bravest of the brave. But when the empire began to crumble, even bravery couldn't resist exhaustion. After Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, Ney swore allegiance to the restored Bourbon monarchy. He promised to bring the emperor back to Paris in an iron cage if he ever returned. Yet when Napoleon escaped exile and marched through France, soldiers and citizens rallied to him, and Ney's heart cracked. Meeting his former master face to face, he broke his oath. Instead of arresting him, he embraced him. For a brief moment, France was united again. Then Waterloo came. Napoleon fell for the final time, and Ney was branded a traitor by both sides. A loyalist turned rebel, a hero turned criminal. He faced the firing squad with defiance, refusing a blindfold, and gave his final command himself. Aim straight, soldiers. One man's loyalty had burned in two directions and consumed him in both. And while the smoke of Waterloo cleared, the world had one more betrayal to witness, colder, quieter, and far more devastating than war itself. The Tokyo Trials collaborators, post-World War II. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the world expected justice. The victors called it the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, a court meant to judge those responsible for the empire's brutality. But beneath the speeches about peace and accountability, a quieter betrayal unfolded, one written in ink, not blood. Dozens of wartime leaders were charged, yet many of the most powerful walked free. Bureaucrats, generals, and industrialists who built Japan's war machine were quietly protected by the same allies who condemned them. Why? Because the Cold War had begun. America no longer needed revenge. It needed reliable partners. Men who once served the empire were rebranded as allies in rebuilding it. Historians later called it a betrayal of memory, of the civilians, soldiers, and victims who never saw justice. The trials promised truth but delivered politics. Those who confessed were shamed, those who cooperated were rewarded, and those who stayed silent shaped Japan's future. By the time the final verdicts were read, justice had become a performance. The world had moved on, pretending the scales were balanced. But history remembers what paper forgets. History's full of crowns, wars, and glory, but when you really dig into it, most of it comes down to something smaller. Someone trusted the wrong person. Someone made the wrong promise, and everything that came after was built on that crack. I know it's easy to call them villains, but the truth is simpler. Power always tests loyalty, and history remembers whoever survives the test. If you want more stories that dig into the parts of history people try to forget, you know what to do. Like, comment, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which betrayal hit you the hardest.